Part 1. The House with the Green Shutters. Before a man knows he is lonely, the land usually knows first. In the spring of 1948, when the red dirt roads of Franklin County still turned to thick clay after a rain, and most folks measured distance in fence posts instead of miles, there stood a narrow farmhouse at the bend of Cottonwood Road. It wasn't much to look at, white paint peeling, porch sagging slightly on the left, but the shutters were painted a stubborn green that refused to fade, and the front yard held 3 pecan trees older than anyone living there. That house belonged to Thomas Hale. Thomas was in his early 50s that year, though the lines around his eyes suggested something older, like he'd been counting storms instead of birthdays. He lived alone except for a yellow dog named Scout, who had one torn ear and a patience for silence that matched his owner's. Most mornings, Thomas rose before the sun, not because he had to, but because he couldn't seem to sleep past dawn anymore. He'd sit at the kitchen table with a chipped enamel mug of black coffee and stare out the east window as the fields slowly revealed themselves. First the outline of fence posts, then the tall grass bending in morning wind, and finally the distant barn roof catching the first slice of light. It was on one such morning that the letter arrived. The postman, Earl Bickman, didn't usually come down Cottonwood unless there was something worth delivering. Thomas heard the truck coughing up the hill before he saw it. Scout lifted his head but didn't bark. Thomas stepped onto the porch, boots unlaced, suspenders hanging loose at his sides. "Morning, Thomas," Earl called, handing over a single envelope. Thomas nodded. "That all?" "That's all." The truck rattled away, leaving behind a swirl of dust and the faint smell of gasoline. The envelope was cream-colored, thin, and addressed in handwriting Thomas hadn't seen in over 20 years. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he sat in the porch rocker his father had built long ago and turned the letter over in his hands as if it might speak first. The return address said only, "Margaret Hale, Cincinnati, Ohio." Margaret. He hadn't spoken her name aloud in years. Back in the mid-1920s, Cottonwood Road had been louder. Thomas's father, Elijah Hale, worked the same land his father had broken with mules before the railroad cut through Franklin County. They grew corn, soybeans, and sometimes tobacco when the market looked promising. There wasn't much cash, but there was always work. Margaret came to town that summer to stay with her aunt after her own father died in a factory accident up north. She was young then, with hair the color of chestnuts and a way of speaking that made every sentence sound like a question waiting to be answered. Thomas first saw her at the general store. She stood near the flour sacks, examining a jar of preserves like it held secrets. "You ain't from here," he'd said without thinking. She turned, smiled slightly. "Is it that obvious?" "You're looking at the label. Folks here just grab what they know." "And how do you know I don't know?" He didn't have an answer to that. They married a few years later in the small white church near the river. The preacher mispronounced her middle name. It rained during the ceremony. Thomas remembered the way her fingers trembled when she placed the ring on his hand, not from doubt, but from cold. They were happy in the way young people are when they believe hard work can outrun any storm. But storms have longer legs than youth. Thomas opened the letter that afternoon at the kitchen table. Inside was a single page. "Thomas, I don't know if this will reach you, or if you'll care to read it if it does. I've thought about writing 100 times and stopped myself just as often. I'm ill. The doctors say it's my lungs. They use words that don't change the outcome. There's something you deserve to know, something I should have told you long ago. If you can find it in your heart to come to Cincinnati, I would like to see you. Margaret." There was no signature flourish, no apology, no explanation, just that. Thomas folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. His hands didn't shake, his breathing didn't change, but something inside him shifted, like a beam in an old barn giving way after years of quiet rot. Margaret left at the start of the Great Depression, the year the bank in town closed and men began standing outside in their Sunday coats, waiting for news that never improved. The crops had failed 2 seasons in a row. Prices dropped so low it cost more to haul corn to market than you'd earn selling it. Thomas worked from sunup to dark, and Margaret tried to keep spirits high. She canned what little they had, took in mending from neighbors, played hymns on the upright piano that had belonged to Thomas's mother. But there are hungers that food can't quiet. Margaret had grown restless. "I don't want to spend my life watching the horizon. I want to see what's beyond it." Thomas lay on the bed, boots still on, too tired to argue. "There ain't much beyond it." "How do you know? You've never gone." "I've got land here." "And I've got nothing," she said softly. He didn't understand then what she meant. A few months later, she boarded a train with a small suitcase and a promise to write. The letters came at first. Cincinnati was busy, loud. She found work sewing in a department store. She met people who talked about art and politics and places farther east. Then the letters grew shorter. Then they stopped. Now, years later, she was asking him to come. Thomas sat at the kitchen table until the light faded and the house grew blue with dusk. He could ignore it. He could burn the letter and let the past stay buried. But something about the way she wrote, something you deserve to know, dug under his skin. He stood, went to the bedroom, and pulled a small tin box from under the bed. Inside were the letters she'd sent before silence swallowed them. He hadn't read them in years. He didn't read them now. Instead, he packed a single suitcase. Scout watched from the doorway, tail thumping once against the floor. "You'll have to stay with Amos," he said quietly. Amos Jenkins lived half a mile down Cottonwood. Widower, talked too much, but dependable. Thomas hadn't left Franklin County in over 20 years, but the next morning he locked the green shutters tight and walked down the road toward the bus stop near Route 16. The field stretched wide and indifferent on either side. The horizon didn't look any closer. The bus smelled of diesel and stale tobacco. Thomas chose a seat by the window and kept his hat on his lap. As the county slipped behind him, replaced by towns he didn't recognize, he felt something he couldn't quite name. Not anger, not hope, something unfinished. Across the aisle sat a young soldier in uniform, no older than his early 20s. The boy caught Thomas staring. "Headed somewhere important?" the soldier asked. Thomas considered the question. "I suppose so," he said finally. The soldier grinned. "I'm going home. Haven't seen my folks in years." Thomas nodded. He wondered what it would feel like to be welcomed somewhere. By the time the bus pulled into Cincinnati, night had fallen. The city lights startled him, so many of them blinking and humming like restless stars brought down to earth. He stepped onto the pavement, suitcase in hand, feeling suddenly smaller than he had ever had on Cottonwood Road. Margaret's address led him to a narrow brick building near the river. He stood outside for a long time before knocking. A woman answered, but she wasn't Margaret. She was young, with the same chestnut-colored hair and the same questioning eyes. "Yes," she said. Thomas felt the world tilt slightly. "I'm looking for Margaret Hale." The young woman studied him carefully. "You must be Thomas." It wasn't a question. And in that moment, before she spoke another word, Thomas understood that the thing Margaret had never told him was standing right there in the doorway.